It began on a forgotten stretch of highway where a veteran's eyes pierced the downpour to find a car engulfed in flames. Trapped inside, an elderly woman trembled, paralyzed by a terror born from a storm that had once stolen everything from her. He tore her from the wreckage just moments before it erupted into a fireball. Dawn brought her safety, but for him it brought dismissal, punished for the heroism that made him late. But fate refuses to be ignored, especially when the very woman he saved walked silently back into his life. And the truth she carried would transform his deepest shame into an unbelievable miracle. What would you have done? And before this story unfolds, we ask you to please like, share, and subscribe. The pines along Highway 19 bowed like titans in mourning, heavy under the crushing force of the storm. Their drenched needles lashed through the wind as curtains of rain swept across the blacktop. A profound and unsettling darkness had fallen over the night, the kind of pitch black that devoured headlights and twisted familiar roads into something menacing and unknown. Elias Rowan gripped the wheel of his weathered silver pickup, his knuckles white against the chill. At 40 years old, his very posture was a testament to a life spent bracing for the next blow, his broad shoulders set like a permanent shield. His jaw was tight with an unwavering focus, his storm-blue eyes darting from the deluged road to the mirrors ever vigilant, his rugged face marked by a shadow of stubble and a pale scar tracing his left cheekbone, was illuminated in stark flashes of lightning that ripped the heavens apart. His only anchor in this tempest was the solid, unwavering presence of the dog at his side. Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, was a powerful sable-coated shepherd whose keen amber eyes missed nothing, his black saddle markings seeming to deepen with his focus. Even now he sat ramrod straight on the passenger seat, showing no fear, not a tremor, not a whimper, just the profound alertness that only a former combat K9 could possess. His ears pivoted with each thunderclap, his breathing steady, yet waited as if he'd perceived a threat his human could not. Ranger was always a step ahead. In Afghanistan, he could sense danger long before any soldier saw it. And tonight that instinct was as electric as the lightning itself. Elias downshifted the old pickup, groaning as it clawed its way up a rain-slicked incline. The graveyard shifts at Northwood Grill always left him bone-weary, especially after 12 hours chained to a blistering industrial stove, making the ache in his arms throb with a life of its own. Still, this long drive was better than returning to a hollow city apartment. His cabin offered a profound silence, the kind that didn't feel empty but whole and honest. But tonight that peace felt fragile as the storm hammered his truck like a fist demanding to be let in. Then, Ranger's growl sliced through the noise. A low rumble at first, nearly lost in the deluge. His ears shot forward, every muscle pulled taut. His entire body went rigid, and he planted a paw firmly on the dashboard, bracing himself toward something hidden in the darkness. Elias shot him a look. "Buddy, what is it?" Ranger's answer was never spoken. It was always shown. Instead, his growl deepened, becoming the same visceral warning that had once saved Elias's life during a raid overseas. Elias sat bolt upright, his eyes straining to cut through the muddy, rain-streaked blur of his windshield. Another flash of lightning tore across the sky, revealing the unthinkable on the highway before him. A silver sedan ahead veered wildly, its tires losing their grip on the slick asphalt. In one terrifying, uncontrollable spin, the car spun across the wet road like a flipped coin. It then slid sideways, slamming head-on into a towering pine tree, its rear end lifting with the force of the impact. A shower of sparks erupted from the hood instantly, followed by plumes of smoke, and then the dreaded flicker of flames. Elias stomped on the brakes. His truck hydroplaned for a heartbeat before shuddering to a halt. Ranger let out a sharp, urgent bark. There was no fear in it, only a desperate call to action. Elias felt his own heart pounding in his throat. On pure instinct, he threw his door open and sprinted into the deluge, the icy rain cutting into him like a knife. Ranger leaped out right at his heels, his paws churning through the pooling water on the highway. As Elias closed the distance, He could see a figure pinned in the driver's seat. A woman? No, a lady clearly of a certain age and grace. Even amidst the chaos, she appeared to be in her 60s, her silver hair plastered to her cheeks by the rain. She was wearing a long red wool coat, now ripped from the impact, and a dark green knitted scarf was twisted around her neck. One of her high heels dangled from her foot. The other was jammed awkwardly against the floorboard as she fought to move. Her face ghostly pale, though elegant and etched with the lines of a long life, was contorted in panic with every clap of thunder. Elias lunged forward. The heat radiating from the engine fire intensified with each passing second. The driver's door was wedged shut. He seized the frame with both hands, planting his feet on the slick pavement, his muscles screaming with the effort of his pull. The metal shrieked in protest but refused to yield. Ranger circled the wreck, barking insistently, his cries a stark warning that their time was up. Inside, the woman choked out, "Please, you have to get me out. Please." Her voice was fractured, not just with fear, but with a sorrow that ran much deeper. She recoiled violently as another bolt of lightning tore the sky apart, her whole body convulsing like a child trapped in a terrible nightmare. Something in her eyes told Elias this was more than just the crash. This was about a memory, old, brutal, and relentless. Elias let out a guttural roar, renewing his assault on the door. One final heave. The metal shrieked as the door finally ripped free, just enough for him to force his shoulder in and wrench it open. He quickly unfastened her seatbelt. She clung to him, her body racked with uncontrollable tremors. It was partly from the shock, and partly from a hidden wound he couldn't see. "Ma'am, I have you," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the heart of the storm. "I'm going to lift you out now. Just keep your eyes on me." The woman nodded, tears carving paths through the rain on her face. Ranger barked again, 3 sharp staccato bursts. Elias knew that signal instantly. Danger! Move now! He lifted the woman, struck by how frail she felt beneath her heavy wool coat. She was shaking so violently he could feel it through his own jacket. Ranger began to lead them away, backing toward the truck, always keeping his own body positioned between them and the fiery sedan. The moment they were clear, a thunderous explosion ripped through the engine, launching a fireball of sparks and flame high into the night sky. A choked sob escaped her as she buried her face in Elias's chest, and he held her a human shield until the inferno's fury subsided. He gently eased her into the passenger seat of his truck, while Ranger, ever watchful, leaped into the open bed. As Elias cranked, the heat steam rose from their soaked clothes, and her breathing was a ragged, uneven rhythm of shock. Her breaths, though shaky, slowed as safety set in. "My name is Margaret," she finally whispered the words, catching in her throat. Her voice, though torn apart by terror, still held the delicate trace of a life lived with grace and refinement. "Margaret Hale." Elias met her gaze, his voice steady. "Elias Rowan, this is Ranger." The dog raised his head in a quiet acknowledgement, his amber eyes watching her with a tenderness that defied his wartime origins, and Margaret stared back in stunned disbelief. He knew, didn't he? He knew before my car even crashed." Elias glanced back at the Ranger. "He often does." Outside, as lightning split the sky, the flames devoured what was left of her car. Margaret flinched with such force the whole truck shook her hand, grabbing Elias's arm with the desperate grip of a drowning woman. But then Ranger did something unexpected. He didn't bark, didn't stand guard. Instead, he gently laid his paw on her knee, his gaze fixed on hers with a focused intensity as if he could see into her very soul, as if he recalled a secret she'd never told a soul. Margaret froze, her breath catching. Her eyes widened in a flash of impossible recognition, as if she knew him from a memory buried deep within her past. Then, in a fleeting whisper, she spoke a name Elias didn't know, Michael. When Elias asked about Michael, she refused to answer, just shaking her head sharply as she fell silent. But her look left Elias with a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. The connection between her past and Ranger's eerie reaction promised a story far larger then the smoldering wreck behind them. Elias drove her through the winding forest toward the safety of his cabin. It was a small but solid wooden structure, nestled securely between towering pine trees. Inside, he kindled a fire and wrapped a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders. Ranger settled at her feet, a comforting, silent guardian. He was close but respectful of her space. As the fire crackled to life, Margaret's voice, when it returned, was fragile. She spoke in broken fragments of a night 3 decades ago. Another storm, another highway, another crash. And the night she lost both her husband and her son. The trauma was etched so deep into her soul that thunderstorms could still make her body tremble. Tonight she was forced to drive herself her personal chauffeur, having been suddenly hospitalized. She tried to conquer the road once more, and fate had punished her for it instantly. Elias listened in silence. He never spoke of the ghosts from his own wars, but in her pain he recognized a familiar echo of his own. The soft rhythm of rain on the roof replaced the memory of screeching metal. A quiet settled over them. Not quite peace, but the somber bond shared by 2 survivors of nights that should have claimed them. When at last Margaret surrendered to an exhausted sleep on the sofa, Ranger curled up protectively at her feet, his head a steadfast guardian by her ankle. Elias stood frozen in that moment, sensing a profound shift in the very air of the room, something he couldn't yet define. A new story was beginning here, one neither of them had chosen, but one they were now inescapably a part of. The tempest outside raged on relentlessly, but within the cabin's humble walls, a far more personal storm was finally finding its calm. Elias mechanically poured himself a mug of steaming water, his gaze lost in the rain-streaked window pane, and wondered how such an ordinary night had become the turning point for his entire existence as the rain continued its endless descent. Ranger held his silent vigil while the woman in the crimson coat slept bathed in the gentle flickering light of the hearth. She was safe for now. This was only the beginning. As dawn broke, sunlight tenderly crept through the cabin windows, painting warm streaks across the wooden floor, gently erasing the last shadows of the storm. The fierce winds of the night had finally surrendered. In their wake, only the soft crackle of drying wood and the steady, distant rhythm of rain dripping from the pines remained. Elias Rowan was at the small stove, his broad back a protective silhouette against the morning light as he prepared a humble breakfast. He prepared oatmeal eggs and a pot of ginger tea, a simple offering he hoped would soothe the deep chill still settled in Margaret's bones. Each of his movements was measured and deliberate, almost reverent, as if a single loud sound might fracture the delicate peace settling over the cabin. Behind him on the sofa, Margaret Hale rested beneath a heavy wool blanket, a woman of 60 years who wore her age with a quiet grace. The sharp, elegant lines of her face, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, a perfectly straight nose spoke of a life lived with unwavering resolve. It was the quiet elegance of a woman who had weathered life's storms with dignity. Her silver bob fell in soft waves framing her weary face, and while exhaustion was etched upon her, her eyes held a profound depth that told of a lifetime spent loving fiercely and losing even more so. Her crimson wool coat, now dry, was placed carefully on a wooden rack, a stark contrast to her dark green scarf and black high heels. Even in this rustic shelter, her few belongings spoke of a world of quiet sophistication. Ranger was at her side, his head resting gently on her shin. The noble German shepherd was a portrait of calm, yet his senses were ever vigilant. But the way he'd chosen his post beside Margaret hinted at a profound protective bond that no amount of training could ever create. His intelligent amber eyes lifted to meet Elias's as the man approached with the tray of food, a silent exchange passing between them. His tail gave 2 soft, reassuring thumps against the floor. "You're quite the guardian, aren't you?" Margaret whispered to Ranger, a weary smile touching her lips as Elias placed the tray on her lap. "You remind me of..." She trailed off, her voice catching. For a fleeting moment, a shadow crossed her face, the memory dissolving like smoke before she could give it a name. Elias saw it. "Of who?" he asked softly. Margaret simply shook her head, her gaze distant. She tightened her grip on the blanket. "It doesn't matter. Sometimes the past just visits as a ghost, a shape you can no longer quite recognize." Her eyes drifted to the window, as if the morning light itself was summoning specters from her past. Elias didn't push. He understood better than most that some wounds are buried too deep for casual conversation. His own history was a landscape of shadows he never spoke of. It was haunted by the faces of those he couldn't save, by the endless nights after battle, when the silence screamed louder than any cannon fire. But he wasn't ready to walk back into those memories, and he knew with a certainty that needed no words that she wasn't ready either. She ate in measured bites, her hands betraying a slight tremor whenever a low rumble of thunder echoed from the mountains, even though the heart of the storm had passed. Elias watched her every subtle reaction, his gaze unwavering. He knew fear had seen it in its rawest form, that primal, instinctive terror, but this kind of trauma etched itself deep into a person's soul. It wasn't a memory in the mind, but a reflex coiled in the spine, poised to strike the moment the world mirrored an old waking nightmare. "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking the quiet. Her voice was quiet, yet it held a surprising strength. "You never asked for any of this. Finding a stranger taking care of me in the dead of night. The moment I saw that car wrap around the tree, you stopped being a stranger," Elias replied. "You were someone who needed help. That's all that mattered." Margaret's eyes met his, a storm of gratitude and utter disbelief swirling within them. "People just don't do things like that anymore," she murmured, her voice laced with a lifetime of caution. "Not without wanting something back." Elias offered a slight shrug. "Guess I'm not people. I'm just me." And for the first time since the world had turned upside down, a soft, warm breath of a laugh escaped her lips. At the sound, Ranger lifted his head, his ears instantly alert, as if her simple joy was a command he'd been waiting for. Once they'd finished eating, Elias settled across from her, lacing his fingers together. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "When you feel ready," he said gently, "I need you to tell me what happened. Not about the crash, about what came before." Margaret gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if she had been anticipating this question and dreading it all the same. She drew a deep, shaky breath, gathering her strength. "It was 30 years ago," she began. "And the rain, it was just like this. The kind that doesn't just fall, it hammers against the world." Her gaze drifted past him toward the frost-etched window pane, her voice taking on a hollow, distant tone. "My husband, Daniel, he was driving. We were coming home from our anniversary dinner. Our son, Michael, he'd just turned 17. He had my eyes and my stubborn streak." A phantom of a smile touched her lips before vanishing. "We were celebrating. He'd just been accepted into a music conservatory in Boston. He was going to be a concert pianist." She paused, swallowing against a knot in her throat. "A truck. It hydroplaned right in front of us. Daniel swerved. It was pure instinct. Everyone always said he was such a careful driver. But the road was a sheet of black ice. The car rolled twice. I was thrown clear of the wreckage. They weren't." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his own chest. Beside the hearth, Ranger let out a low, mournful whine, as if he understood the crushing weight of her words. "I've run from thunderstorms ever since," she continued, her voice thin. "I survived the crash, but the sound of the storm never left me. It's like the thunder is still trapped somewhere inside my head." She drew a sharp breath, squeezing her eyes shut against the memory. "Last night, when the storm hit, I was right back in that car again." Elias nodded, his expression full of a deep, knowing sorrow. "Trauma never really leaves you. It just finds new ways to haunt you." Margaret opened her eyes, looking at him now with a new kind of curiosity. "You say that like a man who's weathered a few storms of his own?" He offered no reply, but in the quiet that stretched between them, his silence was a confession. As the fire spit and crackled, Ranger shot to his feet, his entire body suddenly rigid as stone, his ears locked forward, his gaze fixed on the cabin door with an almost unnerving intensity. Elias followed the dog's line of sight, a strange shift in the air, telling him that something was just outside, pressing in on them without making a sound. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter, a sudden chill seizing her as her breath caught in her throat. "What is it?" She breathed, her voice a fragile whisper. Ranger took 2 steps toward the door, tail rigid, before turning his intense gaze back to Margaret. He wasn't looking at Elias. His eyes held a profound, unsettling recognition that didn't belong in this moment or in this place. Margaret's eyes went wide, her pupils flaring with a terror born of memory. "That look!" she gasped. "My son!" "Michael, my boy. He had those same eyes, whenever he tried to comfort me." She swallowed hard, her voice shattering. "Why does your dog look at me as if he knows me?" A cold dread crept up Elias's spine. Ranger only acts like that when he feels something he can't explain. "Weh. Or something he remembers," Margaret added, her whisper so faint it was nearly lost to the wind. But how could he possibly remember a boy he's never met? The wind howled, pressing against the cabin's fragile walls. The question hung heavy in the air between them. Dangerous, impossible, and yet undeniably real. Ranger moved back to Margaret's side, the tension leaving his body as suddenly as it had arrived, as if the phantom presence he'd detected had finally moved on. Elias watched them both, his gaze sharp and questioning. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. There was a connection here that defied all logic, that couldn't be mapped. Perhaps it was one soul's trauma recognizing another's, or perhaps invisible threads had bound them together long before that fateful night. After Margaret finished her tea, she rose, her legs unsteady at first, but finding strength with every steadying breath. Ellis retrieved her coat and gently helped her drape the heavy crimson wool across her frail shoulders. The vibrant color was a stark, beautiful contrast against her pale skin and silver hair, lending her an almost mythical air in the rustic cabin. "I have a car meeting me at the nearby ranger station," she said softly. "My driver was just released from the hospital this morning." Her fingers, still trembling, adjusted her scarf. "I need to see my attorney. Today. There are matters, unresolved matters that must be attended to." Elias helped her to the truck and drove her toward the station. Margaret was silent for the ride, her hand occasionally resting on Ranger's head, as if drawing strength from his steady presence. When they pulled up to the station, she reached out and took Elias's hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "You saved my life," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You and this incredible dog. It's a debt I fully intend to repay." Elias simply shook his head. "There's no debt. It was just people helping people." A sad, knowing smile touched Margaret's lips. "You don't understand who you've helped," she insisted softly. "But you will." She stepped from the truck as her driver, a thin, middle-aged man named Davis, his ash-brown hair neatly combed and his manner polite but remote, opened the car door for her. He offered Elias a respectful nod before gently guiding Margaret into the back seat. Ranger watched the sedan drive off, his tail low, not with fear, but with a quiet sense of expectation. As the car vanished around the bend in the road, Elias rested a hand on Ranger's head. "We're going to see her again, aren't we, boy?" he murmured. Ranger answered with a single soft bark, and Ranger had never been wrong. The Monday morning rush at the Northwood Grill was a symphony of its own, a chaotic rhythm of clattering plates and orders being shouted over the constant roar of the industrial kitchen vents, and the rich aroma of roasted coffee that filled every inch of the vast dining room. Outside, the sun had just crested the rooftops of Cold Ridge Bay, painting the windows in strokes of gold. But inside, there was only a chill. Elias Rowan pushed through the employee entrance, a quiet apology carried on his steady breath. He was only 7 minutes late, but in the unforgiving world of a high-pressure kitchen, 7 minutes was an eternity. His boots still carried the scent of dew and pine from the walk he'd taken after entrusting Ranger to Tom Barker at the security booth. Tom, a 55-year-old former reservist with a powerful chest and hands weathered by time, and a deep, unwavering kindness etched into his eyes, had welcomed Ranger with the genuine delight he showed every single morning. He'd often joke that Ranger was the best part of his shift. And Ranger, with his dark sable coat and solemn gaze, would always respond by leaning gently against Tom's leg, a rare display of trust he reserved for few. But inside the restaurant, trust was a currency in short supply. Brad Kellerman, the floor manager, stood blocking the swinging kitchen doors, his back turned like a wall of defiance, his arms folded tightly across his chest. He was in his early 40s, shorter than Elias, but with a stocky, confrontational build, a belly straining the buttons of his gray dress shirt. His hair was shellacked with too much gel combed into a severe side part, with an air of forced importance. His face, unnervingly smooth and flushed, held a cruel sneer just waiting to break through. His small, dark eyes narrowed the instant Elias stepped into the kitchen. "Well, look who it is," Brad announced, his voice booming. He waved a metal spatula like a conductor's baton, signaling the start of a cruel symphony. "Our resident hero, back from saving the world, I presume?" The line cooks froze. A young server clutching a tray of polished glasses halted mid-step, narrowly avoiding a prep station. The dishwasher, a quiet teenager named Cooper, ducked his head as if bracing for a blow. "I'm sorry I'm late," Elias said, his voice calm and even. His deep voice was steady, utterly devoid of defense. "There was an accident last night. Brad silenced him with a raised hand. "Nobody cares." His voice sliced through the kitchen's din like a whip. "You think the customers stop eating just because you decide to grace us with your presence? This isn't a charity and your service record—" He gestured with contempt at the dog tag visible at Elias's collar, peeking from beneath his chef's coat. "Doesn't buy you any special treatment here." Elias's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. He'd learned long ago that rage was a useless weapon not on the battlefield, and certainly not in a kitchen ruled by a fragile ego. "I was helping an elderly woman who'd crashed her car." Elias continued, his tone unwavering. "I couldn't leave her alone in the storm. That's why I'm late." "Oh, save the sob story," Brad snapped, rolling his eyes with theatrical disgust. "Your job is to serve food, Rowan, not sermons." A few diners seated near the pass-through window glanced over. Brad smirked, reveling in his small audience. Elias took a slow, deliberate breath through his nose. "Brad, I am trying to explain." Brad closed the distance between them, his breath a sour mix of cheap coffee and mints. "And I'm telling you I don't care. I need a reliable cook, not a storyteller." Elias met his gaze not with anger, but with an unbreakable calm. His refusal to break only fueled Brad's rage. The rest of the morning became a blur of searing heat and relentless orders. Elias moved with quiet, firm precision, his hands steady with the resolve of a man who'd fed hundreds and stared down death itself. But Brad circled him like a vulture pacing, whispering criticisms, fixing things that were never broken. Then, every few minutes, he hurled a sharp comment over his shoulder loud enough for all the staff to hear. "Burnt the edges again, Rowan. Sloppy. No wonder they sent him packing. Real heroes don't hide in kitchens." The rest of the staff froze, trapped in a painful silence, afraid to risk drawing Brad's fury. Some exchanged sympathetic looks when he wasn't watching, but no one dared to speak up. During the late morning lull, Elias paused at his prep station to grab a fresh, clean towel. Just then, lightning struck outside, a startling flash against the clear daylight, and thunder cracked across the sky with a strange, eerie echo. At that very same moment, Ranger, waiting outside with Tom, let loose a sudden sharp howl that sliced through the restaurant walls like a blade of sound. Not a bark, but a howl, a warning. Elias went still. He knew Ranger's instincts better than his own heartbeat. That sound. He hadn't heard it since Afghanistan, just the night before the explosion that shattered everything. Brad burst from his office, his face a mask of irritation. What in the hell was that? If that mud of yours damages property, whoa! But Elias didn't hear him. A cold knot formed in his stomach. Ranger only howled that way when true imminent danger was near. Something was approaching, and it wasn't a storm. By noon, Brad's foul mood had cooled into a simmering, ugly arrogance. He found his moment when a tray of grilled vegetables came from the line, just a shade too dark on one edge. It was a minor flaw that any other chef would have simply corrected. But Brad seized on the opportunity theatrically. "This is precisely what I mean," he bellowed, holding the tray high like a piece of courtroom evidence. You can't just keep burning food and pretending you're some kind of hero." Elias looked at the tray. The vegetables were not burnt. Far from it. "Brad?" Elias said evenly. "That tray is perfectly fine." "Fine!" Brad barked out a cruel laugh. "Not if I say it isn't." He spun and marched toward the management office at the back of the kitchen. A few moments later, Elias was summoned inside. Inside, seated behind a cold metal desk, was Nolan Graves, the regional general manager of the Northwood Grill. Nolan was in his early 50s, tall and composed with iron-gray hair and deep-set eyes that gave him the bearing of a stern professor. His suit was flawlessly neat, his tie was perfectly straight, his posture unbending, but his expression seemed troubled. He wasn't angry or judgmental, simply weary. Elias Nolan began, his hands folding together. "Brad has reported to me multiple instances of unsafe kitchen conduct." Elias frowned. "That is not true, sir." Nolan sighed heavily. "He is claiming you nearly caused a flare-up this morning." Elias blinked. "Sir, there was no flare-up." Brad leaned with practiced drama against the file cabinet. "He's lying to you, Nolan. I was right there. That man is unstable. He was shaking all morning, probably from the ordeal he endured last night." "It was a car accident," Elias stated, his voice remaining steady. "I was helping someone who needed it." "Enough," Brad snapped. "I will not run a kitchen where people like you put everyone at risk." Nolan squeezed the bridge of his nose caught between the two men, between Elias's quiet conviction and Brad's theatrical rage, but policy was policy. A manager's decision was final. Without any proof, Nolan's hands were tied. "Elias," Nolan said, his voice laced with regret, "I have no other choice but to let you go, effective immediately." For the first time, Elias's expression faltered, not with anger, but with a deep, silent ache. He untied his apron, folded it with care, and placed it on the desk. "Thank you for the opportunity," he said, his voice barely a whisper, then stepped out into the biting afternoon wind. The world suddenly felt louder, yet more hollow than ever before. Ranger tore away from Tom and raced to him, his tail held low, pressing his forehead into Elias's leg. Tom followed his face, a mask of guilt. "I'm so sorry, man," Tom murmured. "I watched Brad prowling all morning searching for an excuse. You didn't deserve any of this." Elias rested a hand on Ranger's head, his fingers sinking into the comforting, familiar thickness of his fur. The dog leaned into the gesture, his amber eyes shining with a loyalty that no human chain of command could ever create or destroy. "Come on, boy," Elias whispered, his resolve firming. "Let's head home." As they walked away from the Northwood Grill, the wind carried a faint, ominous rumble of thunder from a clear sky, and Ranger glanced back at the building one more time, a long, hard stare before following Elias. A storm was coming, a storm that neither of them could yet put a name to. The late afternoon crowd at Coldridge Mall moved in its usual frantic rhythm. People rushed past storefronts with paper coffee cups. Teenagers' laughter echoed up from the escalators, and the gleaming marble floor reflected the pale winter light, filtering down through the immense glass ceiling. The air held the faint scent of cinnamon from a nearby bakery, and the collective chatter of shoppers created a soft, constant hum, but all of it seemed to fade almost imperceptibly when the woman in the long red coat stepped through the eastern entrance. Margaret Hale moved with a quiet grace that could hush a room without her ever speaking a word. Her red wool coat flowed behind her like a banner, a rich green scarf wrapped elegantly around her shoulders. Her high heels clicked with sharp authority on the floor with each measured step. Silver hair framed her face, and her eyes, calm yet searching, held a profound depth that told a story of both sorrow and immense strength. She carried a woven basket in her left hand, wrapped in a white cloth from which the sweet scent of fresh pastries drifted. She looked out of place, not because she didn't belong, but because she seemed as if she belonged somewhere far more magnificent. An opera hall, a private boardroom, a grand holiday gala, not the ordinary commercial plaza surrounding the Northwood Grill. Tom Barker, stationed at the security booth just outside the restaurant, was the first to lay eyes on her. He had been leaning back casually against the booth, Ranger sitting dutifully by his right side. Ranger's amber eyes remained a steadfast vigil locked on the door Elias had vanished through hours before. Tom's posture snapped to attention the moment he saw Margaret's coat. It was the kind of coat you never forget. Then his eyes caught the glint of her charity pin, just beneath the lapel, a small silver emblem shaped like a torch. He'd only seen it once years ago and never dreamed he would see it again here. She walked toward him, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "Excuse me," she began, her voice warm, yet laced with an undeniable urgency. "Is this the Northwood Grill? I'm trying to find someone." Tom nodded, touching the brim of his cap. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help?" Ranger stood his tail low, but his focus sharp, as he looked up at her with a flicker of pure recognition. A softness washed over Margaret's face at the sight of the dog. "I'm searching for a man named Elias Rowan," she said, her eyes pleading. "He works here, or he used to." Tom's gaze faltered, shifting to Ranger, as if the dog held the words he couldn't find. Margaret felt the change in the air instantly. The warmth vanished from her smile. "He's not here, is he?" A long, heavy sigh escaped Tom's lips. The lines etched into his weathered face seemed to deepen. "Ma'am, they let him go. Just a couple of hours ago." Margaret froze, the world falling silent around her. It was as if every sound in the bustling mall simply ceased to exist. "Earth." "Fired," she echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. "For what possible reason?" Tom just shook his head slowly. "Management claimed it was about his performance," he said, then lowered his voice to a near whisper. "But Elias? He's the finest man I've known in years. This place was never good enough for him." Ranger moved closer to Margaret, pressing his shoulder against her, a silent comfort for the storm he sensed brewing inside her. Her hand found his head instinctively, the solid warmth a much-needed anchor, but the sharp glint of shock never left her eyes. "Who is it that fired him?" she demanded, her voice now cold steel. "Brad Kellerman," Tom answered softly. "He's the floor manager." Margaret drew herself up to her full height. In that instant, she was no longer a woman healing from a past trauma. She was a force, someone who had wielded power for a lifetime, and knew precisely how to command it. "Where's he now?" Tom gestured toward the restaurant. "Inside, I'd bet. Probably yelling at some poor kid just trying to do their job." Margaret gave a single sharp nod of thanks, her lips pressing into a thin line of resolve, a look both elegant and utterly menacing. She pushed through the glass doors of the Northwood Grill, stepping directly into the controlled chaos of the midday rush. Inside, Brad Kellerman was berating a young server near the counter, the girl clearly on the verge of tears. His voice, shrill with anger, cut through the din of clattering plates and silverware. "I told you table 7 gets their drinks first." "Do you even listen?" He spun around at the sharp click of heels on tile, his face already set for another customer complaint. But the dismissive smirk on his face dissolved when he saw the woman standing before him, poised, elegant, and dressed in a striking red, like a figure carved from winter fire itself. "Can I help you?" Brad stammered, as he nervously straightened his shirt, his voice unsteady as he feigned politeness. Margaret placed the basket of pastries on the counter with deliberate grace. "I'm looking for the manager." "That would be me," Brad interjected quickly, puffing out his chest in a weak attempt to reclaim his authority. "Brad Kellerman, floor manager of the Northwood Grill. If there's some kind of issue—" "Noor." "I'd be glad to. "I'm here regarding Elias Rowan." Margaret stated, her voice serene, yet possessing a weight that hushed the very air around her. "It has come to my attention that he was let go this morning." Brad blinked, then let out a forced, dismissive chuckle. You must be one of his friends." "Look, ma'am, personnel matters aren't exactly for public discussion." As he spoke, a woman at a nearby register leaned to her co-worker, whispering audibly, "Is that... Oh my God, I think it's Margaret Hale." Her colleague's sharp intake of breath was a gasp of pure recognition. A man in a gray vest, the assistant manager, hurried over to Brad, hissing urgently into his ear, "That's Margaret Hale. She runs the Hale Veterans Fund." The color drained from Brad's face. "What, the fund that rebuilt half the veterans' homes on the west side? That's the one." Brad swallowed hard, his arrogance deflating instantly. "Ma'am, perhaps we could sit down and talk this over." "No." Margaret set her tone deceptively soft. "We will be discussing nothing today." Her voice was a controlled, courteous whisper, laced with an undertone of unyielding steel. "Tomorrow morning I shall return. I expect a full meeting with your senior management present." She held his stare, letting the gravity of her words settle over every single person in the room. Brad's mouth opened, but no words came. Without awaiting a reply, Margaret turned, collected her basket, and exited the restaurant with the same unwavering grace she had possessed upon her arrival. Outside on the cold sidewalk, Elias stood Ranger, a steadfast presence against his leg, the afternoon's indignity etched on his weary face. But as Margaret approached, his gaze lifted, and Ranger trotted forward, a flicker of recognition in his loyal eyes. Elias straightened, his posture stiff with confusion. "Margaret," he said, the surprise evident in his voice. She halted before him, her breath clouding the frigid air, her eyes alight with resolve, as she offered him the basket with both hands. "I came to offer my thanks," she said, "but what I found instead was a profound injustice." Elias started to speak, but a gentle shake of her head silenced him. "This is not over," she vowed. "Tomorrow we make this right." Ranger moved to stand between them, his gaze fixed unwavering on the restaurant door behind them, a deep growl vibrating in his chest, a clear warning to the injustice that lingered inside. Margaret rested a hand on his loyal head. "Good boy," she murmured. "You see things for what they are." And for a fleeting second, Elias felt a change in the cold winter air, a sense that the previous night's storm hadn't truly passed, but had merely transformed. That night a thick fog settled low over the neighborhood, a pale creeping tide that consumed the streetlights and turned each porch into a lonely island. The homes along Cedar Crest Lane, small and unassuming, separated by patches of frozen lawn, appeared as phantoms behind the swirling veil of mist. Elias Rowan moved slowly down the sidewalk, his faithful companion Ranger pacing steadfastly at his side, the dog's paws making no sound on the damp concrete. A deep cold had begun to seep into the world, reminding him of deployments overseas, a silence thick with tension humming, with an energy that was more than just the biting chill of the air. The afternoon had bled away in a haze of disbelief as he tried to reckon with his termination, but there was nothing to process, only the cold sting of public humiliation. He had been cast aside unjustly for reasons that fractured and fell apart under the slightest scrutiny. Brad Kellerman's disdain had been a constant shadow, but in recent days that animosity had intensified, hardening into something that felt deeply personal. Elias couldn't fathom why, and the long walk had become a torturous loop, replaying every last moment of the day, desperate for the missing pieces. Ranger, however, seemed to sense a danger that Elias could not. The noble shepherd's senses were on a razor's edge, his powerful nose constantly testing the damp, heavy air, his ears pivoted like sophisticated radar dishes, his tail held low, not in fear, but in the focused stillness of a hunter. Elias trusted that instinct with his life. In all their years, Ranger had never once been wrong. As the familiar path of their driveway emerged from the mist, Ranger froze, planting his paws with an unyielding finality. Every muscle coiled tight beneath his dark sable coat, his ears locked forward, A low, menacing growl rumbled deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Elias whispered, his own eyes straining against the swirling fog. And then he saw it, a lone silhouette standing unnaturally still beside his mailbox. The man was hunched, his face eerily illuminated by the ghostly upward glow of a phone screen. He looked to be in his early 40s, wrapped in a thin black jacket ill-suited for the biting cold, his posture coiled with furtive, nervous energy. He was holding a phone, aimed directly at Elias's car, as if documenting a crime scene. The face was a stranger's, a blank in his memory at first. But Ranger knew. A furious, concussive bark tore from his throat, not a warning but a declaration of a present threat, the kind he reserved for deployment when the danger was immediate and real. The figure recoiled violently. The phone slipped clattering across the wet asphalt. He spun around, revealing a face blanched with panic-sharp cheekbones, a bloodless mouth pulled into a tight, desperate line, and eyes that darted with the unease of a man more accustomed to deception than truth. Lank, greasy brown hair was plastered to his forehead, and through that murky veil of fog, the pieces slammed together in Elias's mind. Brad Kellerman, the manager who had shattered his world just hours before. The cold air burned in Elias's lungs. "Brad, what in God's name are you doing here?" Kellerman staggered back, clutching the front of his jacket. I was just... This isn't... His voice, once dripping with smug authority inside Northwood Grill, now splintered with raw fear. Ranger surged forward, a force of pure, protective fury, stopped only by Elias's unshakable grip on his collar. The fur on his back stood erect like a ridge of sharp needles, his eyes locked on Brad with a cold, silent promise of consequence. Kellerman tried to speak again, his voice trembling. "I was checking the license plate. I had to confirm something for a report. You wouldn't get it. You came to my home in the dead of the night." Elias said, his voice low and dangerous as he closed the distance. "To photograph my car. For what reason?" Kellerman flinched as if struck, retreating deeper into the fog's embrace. "Stay away from me. You're unstable." "I'll have my proof," he hissed. "I'll have all the proof that I need." He turned to flee, and in his haste, something dark slipped from his jacket pocket. A small black USB drive landed silently in the damp grass, its fall marked only by a faint metallic tap. Brad never noticed. He scrambled into the mist, stumbling over his own feet as he vanished down the sidewalk, Ranger's furious barks chasing his dissolving shadow until only the silence remained. A slow breath escaped Elias as he stared into the dense fog that had swallowed Brad. Ranger, with a low grumble, tasted the air, then nudged a small object at Elias's feet. The USB drive. Elias knelt, his fingers closing around the cold plastic. Scratches marred one side, and a faded label bore the restaurant's initials, NG Storage 7. He turned it over in his hand, a heavy dread coiling deep in his gut. "What was your plan, Brad?" he whispered to the empty air. Ranger sat at his side, tail low, his gaze a silent, unwavering vigil. Elias rose and slipped back inside the door, clicking softly shut. The house was shrouded in shadows, lit only by a lone lamp over the kitchen table. He sank into a chair, Ranger a comforting weight at his feet, and slid the drive into his aging laptop. For a tense moment, the screen stayed dark. Then a folder materialized, kitchen accident archives containing several video files. With a heavy heart, Elias clicked the most recent file. The screen flickered to life with footage from the kitchen dated 2 weeks earlier. The camera angle showed Elias at the stove, Brad hovering just behind him. At first it seemed normal, then the video began to distort. Frames skipped, showing Elias's hand lurching dangerously close to an open flame as sparks erupted in a way that felt unnatural. A cold fury washed over Elias's face. This never happened. He clicked on another file. This one revealed a tray engulfed in flames inside an oven that had been cold. The next, a grease fire that had never existed. It was all doctored, spliced, rearranged, a tapestry of lies. Brad had been meticulously crafting evidence designed to destroy him. This wasn't just about his job. It was an assault meant to shatter his credibility, his entire reputation. Suddenly, Ranger shot to his feet, his gaze locked on the laptop screen, every muscle in his body taut with tension. His ears twitched, honing in on something within the footage that set him on edge. As an edited spark flared across the display, Ranger emitted a low, haunting whine. A sound Elias hadn't heard since the night an explosion ripped through their unit overseas. For a heartbeat, Elias was confused. Then it hit him, Ranger wasn't reacting to the image. He was reacting to a sound buried in the clip, a faint, distorted echo, one that only a trained K9 could ever recognize. A noise engineered to trigger pure fear, confusion a psychological trigger, a dark tool of manipulation. A deep chill ran down Elias's spine. Brad's sabotage wasn't just malicious, it was precise, detailed, and disturbingly calculated. Someone wanted him utterly broken. Elias leaned back, the crushing weight of this realization settling hard in his chest. Ranger nudged his knee, a gentle but insistent gesture that was both a profound comfort and a silent call to action. This went far beyond a simple workplace grudge. It was a direct attack on his honor as a veteran, on his very integrity as a man, and tonight Brad had brought that fight to his home to escalate it. Elias pulled the USB drive, pacing the length of his living room. Ranger's paws falling in perfect sync with his own heavy footsteps. "This is bigger than being fired," he murmured. "He wants to bury me, make sure there's nothing left to fight with." A low growl rumbled in Ranger's chest, a sound of grim agreement. Elias closed his eyes. Margaret's words from earlier echoing in his mind. Asterisk. "Tomorrow we fix this." But he knew now this wasn't something a simple conversation with management could ever hope to fix. This was the proof. The one thing Brad never dreamed Elias would uncover. He stared at the USB drive clutched tightly in his hand. The dense evening fog pressed in against the windows, blanketing the neighborhood in an unnerving silence. This is war," Elias breathed. Ranger lifted his head, his amber eyes burning like twin coals in the gathering dark. And Elias knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not going to let Brad break him. Not now, not ever. Morning sunlight spilled across the glass facade of the Northwood Corporate Center, catching the frost that clung to the building's edges and scattering it like diamond dust. Inside, however, the air was cold. A palpable tension gathered in the hallways, humming like a low, unseen electrical current. It was quiet, yet impossible to ignore. Employees hurried past, their hushed whispers catching in the corners, adjusting ties and jackets as if bracing for a storm that was brewing not in the sky, but in the very heart of the company itself. The main conference room, typically reserved for quarterly reviews and strategy sessions, had been transformed for the extraordinary meeting. A long oak table, 12 leather chairs, a projection screen humming softly in the background. A carafe of steaming coffee sat untouched on a credenza. Even the blinds were drawn only halfway, letting in just enough morning light to stave off claustrophobia, but not enough to comfort anyone who was seated inside. Nolan Graves was the first to arrive. At 52, tall and lean, with a stern jawline softened only by silver stubble, Nolan wore his authority the way other men wore a uniform. It was an instinct. His iron-gray suit was immaculate, and though his eyes were usually calm, blue-gray pools today, they flickered with a rage he was fighting to contain. He set a stack of documents squarely on the table, then adjusted the projector remote with precise, deliberate movements. This was a man who despised chaos not from weakness, but from the conviction that order was a shield against harm. The door opened again. Tom Barker entered, standing more rigidly than usual in a crisp Navy security uniform. His broad shoulders and square hands spoke of a lifetime of physical work, but his kind hazel eyes could not hide his nerves. He removed his cap respectfully. "Morning, sir," he said to Nolan, who gave him a curt nod. Ranger, padding in behind him, trotted directly to the chair where Elias would soon sit, circling it once before lowering himself under the table, alert but utterly composed. His amber eyes scanned the room the way a soldier surveys the terrain, A moment later, Elias Rowan stepped in. He wore a clean flannel shirt under a faded army green jacket. His dark hair slightly ruffled from the morning wind, his expression calm, but sharpened by the weight of injustice. His posture was straight, not with pride, but with a grounded strength, the stance of a man who'd been in rooms far more dangerous than this boardroom, yet still felt the sting of betrayal more deeply than any bullet. He reached down to touch Ranger's head. The dog responded with a slow tail wag and a soft exhale, as if to reassure him. Then the air in the room shifted a palpable change that drew every gaze to the door. Margaret Hale entered like a whisper that grew into a symphony. Her long red wool coat swept elegantly behind her. Her dark green scarf rested elegantly on her shoulders. Each step she took punctuated by the decisive click of her heels on the conference room floor. Her silver hair shimmered in the slivers of sunlight. Though her face was a mask of calm, a storm of fire raged just beneath the serene facade, a fire that had endured countless storms both of nature and of the heart. She moved with a quiet grace that spoke of a deep understanding of power and the profound responsibility that it carried. A palpable tension filled the room as several managers shifted, recognizing her instantly. Quiet whispers spread like wildfire. "That's her, from the Hale Fund. The woman Brad insulted," one hissed. "What is she doing here?" The answer arrived as she deliberately placed a small basket on the conference table. The gift from the day before intended for Elias now sat silently on the table. "Shall we begin?" she asked, her tone gentle, but lined with cold steel. Nolan motioned for everyone to take their seats. "I appreciate you all coming on such short notice." The last to enter was Brad Kellerman, a pale ghost of the swaggering floor manager they all knew from the restaurant. His usually slick hair was a tangled mess. His shirt creased and worn, his eyes raw and red from a night devoid of sleep. He stopped dead in the doorway the moment he saw Margaret. His face went ghost white, the color of winter's last snow. "Miss Hale," he choked out, trying in vain to stand taller, but his shoulders shuddered beneath an invisible weight. I didn't expect—" "No," Margaret said, her tone perfectly even. "You didn't." Brad sank into his chair with the awkward, rigid motions of a man who knows the verdict before the trial has even begun, but was only waiting to hear the sentence. Nolan officially began the meeting. "We are here today to review a grave accusation, the fabrication of safety incidents, and the manipulation of evidence which resulted in the wrongful termination of Elias Rowan." An audible shockwave of whispers rippled through the room. Margaret folded her hands, silencing the room. "Before anyone says a word, I'd like to begin with the USB drive Mr. Rowan found just last night. Please play it." Nolan nodded to the tech, a thin man in his late 20s, his sandy hair and glasses magnifying a pair of deeply anxious blue eyes. He cued the files, adjusting the speakers. The conference room went dark, illuminated only by the projector's harsh glow. At first, there was only silence. Then the kitchen footage filled the screen. Elias watched himself move like a stranger, his hands chopping vegetables, turning pans plating dishes. But the movements were all wrong, disjointed and flickering like some poorly made, sinister film. Frames were clipped short with timestamps that jumped impossibly from morning to evening in mere seconds. In one jarring moment, a stove burner ignited, untouched by any hand. In the next shot, a tray burst into flame, though no heat source was anywhere nearby. The audio track was a distorted mess with Brad's voice spliced in, shouting at phantom dangers and reactions that never occurred. Margaret watched with an icy expression that could have shattered granite. Nolan's jaw was clenched so tight a nerve throbbed violently beneath his cheek. "Brad?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Do you deny making this?" Brad wiped his sweating forehead, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. It's not what it looks like. I was just documenting safety issues." "He's unstable, That's enough." Nolan snapped, his voice finally breaking its calm for the first time. On screen, the video glitched into another faked inferno. At that exact moment, Ranger rose from under the table, his tail poker straight. his ears suddenly rigid and alert. But instead of a growl, he stepped forward, placing his paw with deliberate gentleness on Elias's boot, an action of pure, unspoken support. It was a sound so deliberate the entire room fell silent. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. A profound meaning flickered in Ranger's amber eyes, as if he grasped truths far deeper than the humans arguing above him. Elias looked down at Ranger, and in that instant the room felt suspended in a quiet, almost reverent hush. As if the dog's presence alone affirmed that the lies on the screen stood no chance against the truth. Around this table, even the managers who had remained silent felt a chill crawl up their arms. Ranger wasn't just warning them. He was bearing witness. Tom Barker cleared his throat, his voice steady. "If I may, I've been here for 5 years. I've worked every single shift. I see everyone who comes and goes." He turned his gaze to Nolan. Elias hasn't been late one single day until yesterday. And on that day, he showed up at my booth soaked to the bone, utterly exhausted. He looked like he'd just pulled someone from a wreck, and he still apologized. His voice grew quiet, with conviction. "He's the most decent man I have ever had the privilege to know." Nolan leaned back, completely stunned. "Thank you, Tom." Margaret's voice cut through the silence. She rose, her red coat sweeping behind her like the final curtain on a play. "Mr. Rowan saved my life 2 nights ago. He pulled me from a flaming car in a storm that would have claimed anyone else." Her eyes locked onto Brad. "And this is how you repay an act of such profound humanity." Brad's mouth gaped open and shut, but no words came out. Nolan then pushed himself up from his chair. His authority washed back over the room. "Brad Kellerman, effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full internal investigation. Your access is revoked. Security will see you out." Brad staggered to his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat. "You don't understand. This isn't—" But Nolan had already given the signal to Tom, who moved forward with quiet purpose. Brad began to back away, stuttering and shaking his head as if his own disbelief could somehow erase the truth that had just been revealed. Margaret turned to Elias, her face softening with compassion. She reached out, placing a gentle hand upon his shoulder. "You deserve so much more than what they've given you," she said softly, "and soon you will have it." Elias bowed his head in gratitude. Ranger leaned against his leg, perfectly calm now, as if justice itself had set the world right again. And just like that, the meeting was over. The fate of everyone in that room had been irrevocably changed. And for the first time in days, Elias felt the faintest ember of something warm and precious glowing in his chest. Not triumph, hope. Along North Cedar Lake, the ice had begun to lose its grip, splintering into pale, fragile shards that drifted gently upon the dark, deep water. The early spring sun danced across the melting surface, warming the cold northern air just enough to coax the first blush of green from the weary shoreline. Birds began to return in scattered flocks, their calls echoing with a bright hope, as if the world itself was choosing to forget the cruelty of winter. But for Elias Rowan, this spring meant more than just a changing of the seasons. It marked the moment his life finally turned from endless hardship toward possibility, a time when the tempests of betrayal and injustice had at last given way to a quiet, hard-won redemption. In the months that followed that explosive meeting at Northwood Grill, the company began to transform in ways no one could have ever predicted. With Brad suspended, and then ultimately fired after the investigation proved the video had been tampered with, Nolan Graves rebuilt the leadership from the ground up, and at the very center of it all stood Elias. What began as a temporary advisory post quickly evolved into something much more permanent. Nolan saw the profound steadiness, diligence, and quiet moral compass Elias possessed, and offered him a position that stunned everyone. Director of Operations for the entire regional network. Elias accepted only after deep consideration. He had never sought authority. But Nolan told him, "Good men rarely want power. That's precisely why they're the ones who deserve it." And so the man who once walked these halls as a line cook now moved through them, with a quiet confidence, greeting everyone with true humility, always taking a moment to ask about their families or how they were doing. And Ranger, ever faithful and beloved by all, swiftly became the restaurant chain's unofficial heart. Guests would arrive hoping to meet the celebrated hero dog. Children would kneel down to scratch behind his ears, and the staff made a small, cushioned nook behind Elias's desk labeled Ranger's Spot, complete with toys and his familiar blue blanket. But the most meaningful transformation was happening far from the workplace. Elias and Margaret Hale drew closer in the passing months. Not through romance, but through something quieter and far deeper, a family bond forged not by blood, but by gratitude and empathy, and the shared weight of surviving storms that never truly leave. Margaret slowly regained her lost strength, walking with more assurance, sleeping more soundly, eating again. She credited this recovery to two simple things: Elias's cooking and Ranger's unwavering presence. "He anchors the entire room," she often remarked, stroking Ranger's head as she sat near the fireplace. "A bit like your son Michael," Elias once asked gently. She looked down, her silver hair brushing against her cheek. "Yes," she whispered softly. "Even after 30 years, the grief doesn't leave. It just finds a quieter voice." Elias helped by repairing her porch's creaking boards, sanding down her worn stair railing, and cooking her meals on nights she felt frail. Margaret found solace not just in Elias's steadfast presence, but in Ranger's warm weight, resting on her feet as she read in her armchair. The dog's gentle breathing filled the silence of her home, a constant living pulse that reminded her she was no longer alone. Everything felt safe, anchored, until the night her heart faltered. It was getting late, close to midnight, when Elias found Margaret collapsed near her bed, her red wool coat half sprawled on the mattress as if she'd reached for it before she fell. Ranger let out sharp barks, pacing around her, nudging her shoulder, whining in desperation. Elias's combat experience kicked in. His hands moved with learned precision, checking her pulse, raising her head, and steadying her breath. He called for an ambulance with one hand, while starting chest compressions with the other. His voice never wavered, but his eyes held a silent fear he refused to surrender to. Margaret survived, but just barely. The doctors called it a severe cardiac arrhythmia, worsened by age and stress, a quiet danger that had lurked inside her heart for years. Upon waking in the hospital, her own well-being was the furthest thing from her mind. "Where are Elias and Ranger?" Elias was right there beside her, and curled loyally at his feet was Ranger, a tranquil guardian now that she was out of harm's way. A faint smile touched Margaret's lips as she reached out to stroke the dog's soft muzzle. "You again?" she breathed. "My sentinel in the storm." From that moment on, a profound shift settled within her, something resolute, something final. In the quiet days of her recovery that followed, Margaret started organizing documents, placing calls, and meeting with lawyers, moving with a quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal purpose. And Elias couldn't help but notice the long, lingering way she would gaze at old photographs of her late husband, of her son Michael, before tenderly returning them to their drawers. She passed long afternoons by the lake, just watching the ice slowly drift away, with Ranger always sitting like a steadfast guardian at her side. Then one gentle spring afternoon, as warm sunlight streamed through her window, she beckoned for Elias to come sit with her. In her hands she held a single sealed envelope. "Elias," she began softly, her voice frail but unwavering with purpose. "That night, out there in the rain, you did more than just save my life. You returned its meaning to me." Her gaze fell to Ranger, who looked back with a profound, solemn intelligence. "He brought me a peace I haven't known since the day I lost my family." Elias simply shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing, Margaret. You've already done more than enough for us." She offered a smile, fragile yet radiant. "I have no family left, Elias. No one to carry on. The Hale estate, this house, the land, all of it." "Calm. And the Veterans Fund will all be lost to strangers unless I decide its future. You saved my life. Twice. Her voice trembled with an emotion she made no effort to conceal. "And I have watched you give everything to others, never asking for anything yourself. I want you to have what I'm leaving behind, not as a payment, but as a legacy." "Margaret?" Elias's voice was barely a whisper. He looked down, completely overcome. She gently placed the envelope into his hands. "Open it when you're ready. My only request is that you carry on my work. Look after the forgotten, care for the lonely, and give our veterans the life of dignity they so rightly deserve. You and Ranger, you were brought to me for a reason." As Elias clutched the envelope, Ranger rose and purposefully walked over to Margaret, gently resting his head upon her lap. It was not a gesture he often made. This one carried a profound weight, an air of true solemnity. Margaret's eyes glistened. "Do you see?" she whispered to Elias. "He knows. Animals can feel the truths we dare not speak." Elias could only nod, his throat tight with unshed tears. Ranger wasn't merely comforting her. He was bearing witness to something sacred passing between them, as if offering his silent blessing upon the choice she had made. As spring truly blossomed, Margaret became strong enough to walk with a cane, her red coat a vibrant splash of color against the thawing world. She made one final visit to the Northwood Grill, personally thanking every employee for the kindness they had shown her. 2 weeks later, she passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news shattered Elias not because it was a shock, but because in losing her he'd lost a part of the world that truly saw and understood him. During her memorial service, the lake shimmered behind them as a gentle wind whispered through the new spring leaves. And through it all, Ranger lay in quiet vigil at Elias's side, his head rising at intervals as if hearing a whisper on a frequency meant only for him. Days later, Elias finally opened the envelope she'd left for him. Within its folds lay her last will, bequeathing her entire estate to Elias Rowan. He was now the steward of her foundation, charged with continuing her service to veterans and the lonely, along with her final handwritten note. "From the night you saved me, to you and Ranger were the family I found in the storm. Let this grant you the power to build a life of service and purpose." And so he honored her wish. As summer bloomed on a peaceful street by the water's edge, a new establishment opened its doors. He chose a name that was more than a tribute to Margaret. It was a testament to every soul who ever weathered an undeserved storm. It was called Second Chance Grill. On the morning of its grand opening, a joyful crowd gathered, sunlight spilling across the hand-carved sign that hung above the entrance. The air itself was a promise rich with grilled herbs, warm bread, and the hope of new beginnings. Ranger lay proudly at the threshold, his coat a halo in the morning sun, his tail tracing slow, grateful arcs in the dust. A life pieced back together, a fate reclaimed. It was all born from a single storm-swept night. For the most profound miracles seldom announce themselves with thunderclaps or blinding light. They arrive in the quietest moments, through a stranger who stops in the pouring rain, a loyal dog who perceives a truth our own hearts cannot. Or in that divine instant, two lost souls are guided onto the same path so that together they might finally find their way home. What unfolded between Elias and Margaret is a powerful reminder that every single act of kindness sends a ripple out into the world. And sometimes those ripples return to us as waves of blessings we never saw coming in a world that so often feels rushed and hardened. Grace always finds a way through the cracks, a steady and patient light, guided by a hand far wiser and more loving than our own. As you return to your own life, may this story be a whisper that reminds you to seek out the small mercies that surround you, to extend your own compassion where it is needed most, and to trust that a greater plan is quietly unfolding in the background of your everyday. If this story resonated deep within your heart, we ask that you share it with someone who might need to feel this hope today. Leave a comment and subscribe to our channel and help us to continue bringing stories of unwavering faith, enduring courage, and the beautiful promise of second chances to the world. May you be blessed and kept safe and may His light be a beacon for your steps today and for all your days to come.